Hi guys, so Mr. B here. So I wanted to make this video since I will be out for part of the day, so that way you can still continue with your notes for section 4.5, and rather than just doing them on your own, be able to have me kind of guide you through the section, so that we can do this together. So make sure that you have your guided notes for this section, so you can fill those out as we go. We're going to talk about maritime empires, continuing on that theme of maritime empires, continuing on the theme of transatlantic trade, and continuing on the theme of mercantilism and things like that. So, those are the things that we're going to talk about today. So, let's get started. Your learning objective for today, we'll talk about how rulers employed economic strategies to consolidate and maintain power throughout this period. So we're going to talk about mercantilist policies, practices that are used by the rulers of European powers to sort of expand and control their economies and claim territory overseas. We'll talk about joint stock companies and how they play into that factor and how they relate to the topic of global trade. And we'll talk about economic disputes that lead to rivalries and conflicts between states. So, if you recall from section 2, we talked about the role of mercantilism in the age of exploration and discovery. European countries are really motivated to explore and colonize other territories because of the mercantilist idea that they need to maximize their exports, minimize their imports, right? The things that they are buying from other countries, in order to create more wealth, more gold and silver coming into their economy. Having that gold and silver on hand is really the key to power, really the key to wealth and power for them. So this is what we call the accumulation of capital, right? It is kind of the central idea to the growth of European empires. And I really want you to keep in mind that capital is any sort of wealth that can be used to create more wealth, right? So think of someone who might invest in a business, right? They are investing capital. They're investing money into a business with the hope that it will be used to create more money or wealth. So some examples that you can think of in the modern context, right? Currency, cash money is really uh, sort of the best idea of modern capital. Money that is in a checking account that can be used immediately with a debit card, that can be spent immediately when you need it. That is liquid capital, really, liquid assets. Uh, but do keep in mind that not all assets are liquid, right? So, for example, if you own a home or your parents own a home, that's considered an asset that might be considered some form of capital, but it's not liquid because you can't take that house with you to the grocery store to buy groceries, for example. So, the idea here, it's a phrase you may have heard before, but the idea here is think of the quote, you've got to spend money to make money, right? That is the idea of the accumulation of wealth. We're going to finance these expeditions, these explorations, with the hope that they will bring back things that we can export, sell, market, and get more money eventually. Uh, so by building empires that work to produce more gold and silver, either through trade, through colonization, or mining gold, the accumulation of capital allowed European countries to really invest in projects that would help increase the reach of the empire. So mercantilism in this period is what leads to what we'll talk about in just a second, joint stock companies, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. So let's also revisit some of the concepts of mercantilism. Okay. These are things that we've talked about earlier in Unit 4. So I want you to recall these principles that make up the economic concepts of mercantilism. So, of course, first you have that mercantilists believe that the wealth in the world is finite, right? There's only so much wealth to go around. That's what kind of finite means, right? There's this limited supply. So that's what really drives them to sort of scramble around to get the wealth for themselves or to bring that into themselves. Wealth or the accumulation of capital is measured in terms of gold and silver, right? So we just talked about the accumulation of capital, what we would consider to be wealth, right? Bringing in money. and that's measured in gold and silver. Third is that a mercantilist state, its goal is to export more than it imports to create what we would call a favorable balance of trade, right? Which essentially means you are selling more things than you are buying from other countries, right? Same would be true for any business, really. You want more people to be buying from your business than things that you need to buy to make your business more. And then lastly, colonies function within mercantilism so that they bring in wealth for the mother country by bringing in amounts of raw materials that are obtained with cheap labor. And colonies are banned from trading with other countries other than the mother country. So, for example, the United Kingdom is considered to be sort of the mother country of what is now the US, or the American colonies. The American colonies could not buy anything really from any other country other than Great Britain, right? Other than the United Kingdom. So that brings in the gold from the colonies, and not only is the country getting raw materials from the Americas, but then they can sell back the finished product back to the colony from there. Okay, so make sure that you have a good understanding of these principles of mercantilism. And of course, as always, if you have questions, let me know. All right. So let's talk about joint stock companies. Okay, you might have some concept of what a stock company or a company is, corporation. And what we want to remember here, especially in this period, is that long distance trade is extremely risky and extremely expensive. So, along with those mercantilist policies, we start to see these things called joint stock companies here in the 1600s. People know that if they could engage in this long distance trade, that it can make them very wealthy. But it's so expensive that barely anyone uh, can afford to do it, right? So, in order to raise enough money, or what we would call capital, in order to raise enough capital, these companies, these joint stock companies, were created to allow a large number of people to invest by purchasing what we call shares of the company. So think of today, right? Uh, Amazon, right? It would be impossible for most people to invest a large enough amount of money to help Amazon operate as a whole. But you can invest a small part of your money, right, into Amazon, maybe buy 2 shares, 3 shares, right, or however much money you have, and you give that money to Amazon. Amazon uses that money, right, and whatever profit they make, they pay you back in part, right? So a large number of people are allowed to buy shares, and those people get dividends. Dividends is payments based on the company's profit, based on how many shares that you own. So this spreads out the financial burden, and it spreads out the risk that is involved with these ventures, this expedition, across a large number of people. So there's two joint stock companies that we will talk about in particular. That's going to be the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. Those two joint stock companies were probably the most powerful, and they were backed by government charter, and that granted them the right to declare wars, um, and and get involved in against anyone who might be considered to be an enemy of their mission, right? And eventually, right, this joint stock company, which there were very many of them, but this gives rise to what we see today in the stock market. That's why today we have the ability to invest in Amazon, in Google, whatever company really. There's a lot of opportunities for you to do that, and something that you'll talk more about when you get into economics. Right? But to give you an idea, right? Use space exploration as an example. NASA is fully government funded. It's paid for by the government. That's not really something that we as a society kind of invest in. Right? The government uses our tax dollars to pay for the space exploration. SpaceX, though, is a privately owned space exploration company, and NASA is, excuse me, and you can invest in SpaceX. You can invest in Virgin Galactic, which is another publicly traded company. And so thinking of it that way, NASA is closer to, say, the Portuguese government sponsoring exploration, or we talked about Christopher Columbus getting sponsorship from the Spanish, King Isabel or King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, right? That's NASA, right? Direct government investment. And the other companies, SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, can be compared to the joint stock companies that we're going to talk about. It's not a perfect comparison, but that's kind of similar in thinking. Okay? But I do want to show you a quick video as well. It's really short, just about a minute long, that talks about these joint stock companies and how they founded settlements here in the Americas. So let's take a look at that.
Some of the most significant early colonies, including Jamestown, Roanoke, and Massachusetts Bay, were founded by corporations called joint stock companies.
Joint stock companies were sort of rudimentary corporations. And the distinctive thing about English colonization is that the government did not have the means or the inclination to fund it.
So corporations raised money by selling stocks. Investors would be rewarded with gold and natural resources found in the New World.
So the king or queen would give a charter to one of these companies to go out and found a colony and give them monopoly control then over the region where that colony was to be. And sometimes the queen would actually contribute as a private investor. She would contribute a ship or something like that. But the government was not going to do this. And so it's all done by private enterprise. And the joint stock company is what makes that possible.
All right, so hopefully that helps illustrate a little bit more about joint stock companies and the work that they did. But let's talk about some of these in particular in some additional detail. So you have the English East India Company, which was founded in 1600, is in existence until 1874. It later becomes called the British East India Company. Okay, and this is actually formed after a series of events by British captains like Sir Francis Drake that showed just how profitable, just how lucrative this business of exploration can be. Right, Sir Francis Drake goes out in 1577 and he wants to raid and rob some of the Spanish ships, some of the Spanish colonies in Asia, in South America. And he's very successful in doing that. And he later goes off into the Pacific and into Southeast Asia and does the same thing. And along the way, he picks up spices, he picks up other goods before he eventually comes back to England 3 years later in 1580. And all of that robbing and plundering and stealing and picking up things brings back a 5,000% return on your money, on the money that was invested. Okay, so for example, to put that into some context, if you had given Sir Francis Drake $1, you would have made back $5,000, right? That's a 5,000% return. And again, this would continue on and be very profitable, this sort of style of doing things, plundering and stealing things, and taking things, really. And that would be very profitable for England. And then it isn't until 1600 when a group of merchants get a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I to start the East India Company. Right, and the first voyage takes place in 1601, captained by James Lancaster, who is pictured on the screen there. So the East India Company, the English East India Company, had its own coins. You see the coin there. Really was established by royal charter, established by the Queen at the time to do this business, right? To seek out investors, seek out expedition, and seek out materials from other colonies and things like that. Okay. The next one we'll talk about here is the Dutch East India Company. You see its Dutch name there. I'm not going to attempt to necessarily pronounce that. But the Dutch East India Company was established in 1602, not long after the English did theirs. And it was formed after a very lucrative, profitable trip to the Spice Islands by a Dutch fleet captained which brought in a 400% profit on its trip. So again, if you were to invest $1 in that trip, right, you would make 400, right, a 400% return. So the company was chartered by the royals, becomes a huge force in Asia. You could buy and sell shares of the company on a secondary market, which later becomes the stock exchange in Amsterdam. But again, this company, this Dutch East India Company, becomes so powerful that it can wage war, it can negotiate treaties with other countries, it can establish its own colonies, which it did, and it even creates its own currency, which you see there on the slide. It establishes a capital in Southeast Asia, in Jakarta, which is in Indonesia, and remains in power there till for at least 200 years, so around 1800. Okay, and again, I want you to keep in mind that these companies were very, very, very profitable. Uh, Over time, probably on average, you're looking at anything from an 18 to 20% return on your money. So every dollar, you're getting 18 to 20 back. That's really good, right? Today, you would be considered very good to be getting like a 10% return on your money. And in some cases, a lot of people get less than 5% today when they make investments. So these companies were very profitable. That profit, the money that they're bringing in, gives them that power as well. So that wealth equates to power. Okay? So let's continue on. Of course, there are other examples of East India companies. The British and the Dutch ones are probably the two most powerful and most well known. Of course, you have some of these others here. The French East India Company, which was founded in 1664 to kind of compete with the Dutch and the British. You have the Danish East India Company, which operates for a few decades, 1616 to 1650. Its focus was trading in tea. The Portuguese had one as well. It was an attempt to compete with the English and the Dutch. Doesn't do so well, right? Only lasting around 5 years. And the Swedish also did one as well for the purpose of trading with China as well. So just keeping in mind some of these other examples of East India companies that do exist. But again, the British and the Dutch are the ones that focus on here. So all of these joint stock companies, and remember the joint stock companies are sort of an extension of the dealings for the government, right? The government is essentially heavily involved in creating these businesses, but is also reaping the benefit and the rewards. They're part of the investment. So they're making some of the investment as well. So these joint stock companies kind of should hopefully paint the picture for you of just how competitive Indian Ocean trade is just within the European states, right? You saw the examples there, but there is some rivalry among other countries, right? Between European traders and Muslim traders. And that's a result of the growing presence of European traders within the Indian Ocean region right now that they've been able to make their way there. So here's a couple of those rivalries that exist. You of course have a rivalry between the Dutch and the Portuguese, and you see an image there of one of their battles off the coast of Goa. We'll talk about some of these in a little bit more detail. You have the Omani European rivalry, and there's a look to the right of the slide of the location of the Omani Empire. Today, modern day country of Oman and Yemen. Okay, but there was a rivalry between the Omanis and the Europeans, and of course the conflict that existed between the Moroccan Empire and the Songhai Empire. We'll talk about that. That comes back after a battle between Portugal and Morocco, which leads to a conflict between Morocco and the Songhai Empire. So we'll talk about some of these in a little bit more detail, but these are the rivalries that do exist in this period. So first up, let's talk about the Dutch and Portuguese War. And I want you to keep in mind that some of these details you may want to include in your notes aren't necessarily included on the screen. So keep that in mind. But the Dutch-Portuguese War is a long conflict that involves a lot of people, a lot of players, lots of locations around the world. Beginning in 1602, kind of working its way out through 1603, so roughly 60 years of conflict. And this was a conflict between the VOC the Dutch East India Company, and the Portuguese Empire, right? They are the major players. You see them identified on the map here as the Netherlands and Portugal. So it's a conflict really between the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, and the Portuguese Empire, right? But also it includes a lot of the allies, a lot of people who are affiliated with both of these, who take part in these conflicts. But the kind of start is a ban on trade that was enacted by King Philip II of Spain, and something called the Iberian Union, right, which is a union between Spain and Portugal, that cuts off the Netherlands from the spice markets in Portugal, in Lisbon. So there starts to be armed conflict in places like Brazil, Africa, or excuse me, throughout the conflict, there is armed conflict in places like Brazil, Africa, India, Macau, Southeast Asia, uh, because those are all key trading places for the colonies, for both of these empires, for the Dutch and the Portuguese. Right? There was no clear winner in this war between the Dutch and the Portuguese, but there's control of certain territories that are sort of determined. So the map that you're looking at on the slide shows where the two sides kind of set at the end of 1663. So of course uh, you have the Portuguese in red along the parts of the African coast, along the Brazilian coast in South America, and then of course places along India, and then of course the light blue or the darker blue, the Netherlands, places like New York, the northern coast of South America, all throughout Southeast Asia, and one small space there in Western Africa. So, moving on, we'll talk about the Portuguese conflict with Morocco. So you have the Battle of Alcácer Quibir, also known as the Battle of Three Kings, which takes place on one day, August 4th, 1578. King Sebastian of Portugal wanted to invade Morocco, right, in order to sort of stop the threat of the Ottoman Empire to the Portuguese commercial interest, right? So again, this need to protect commercial interests, especially in territories like the Azores, those small islands off the coast of Portugal that we've talked about, Madeira, which was that small uninhabited island that Portugal originally found, and of course Brazil and some of the other territories, from threats of the Ottoman Empire. So the battle eventually was very fierce and becomes a crushing defeat for the Portuguese army. King Sebastian and a large amount of his army are killed in the fighting, and this has huge consequences for Portugal. It marks the end of their golden era, the end of their golden ages, and eventually leads to the decline of the power and influence the Portuguese Empire has. So this one moment here in 1578, this one battle with Morocco, is sort of the beginning of the end for the Portuguese Empire. We'll talk more about those things as we go. Okay? The picture that you have here just shows some of those forces that are surrounding the Portuguese, the Moroccan forces that surrounded the Portuguese. So Morocco was successful in this battle, and again, that leads to a devastating consequence for the Portuguese Empire. Okay. Then next you have Morocco's conflict with the Songhai Empire. Okay, so in an effort to sort of recover from that battle of Alcácer Quibir, Morocco, of course, defeating King Sebastian, the Portuguese, the Saadi dynasty of Morocco decides to invade its neighbor. Right? If you see on the map there, the little green space, the Sultanate of Morocco, led by the Saadi dynasty, decides to invade the wealthy Songhai Empire. We've talked about the Songhai Empire a few times before. And the reason for this invasion is purely based on wealth. Morocco had sort of depleted, it had spent all of its own money, right, defeating Portugal, had spent a lot of funds, so it needed to recoup some of that cost. So the Songhai Empire, and I want you to remember that we've talked about the very wealthy city of Timbuktu located in the Songhai Empire. But Timbuktu becomes the target of Morocco as a means to gain wealth through stealing, right, through looting and controlling the gold mines that existed here, which we've talked about as well. So in 1591, you have the Moroccan forces fighting against the Songhai army in the city of Gao. The battle plan for the Songhai Empire wanted to respond to that attempt of invasion, and they attempted to send a stampede of cattle to sort of break through the lines of the Moroccan army. But we want to remember as well that there was trade in weapons and ammunition and guns that we've talked about throughout Africa, throughout northern Africa. So the Moroccans had guns, and those guns scared the cows, right? And they ran away. So eventually, the Moroccan forces are able to defeat the Songhai Empire in Gao. They proceed to then loot and steal things from Gao, from Timbuktu, from Tijen. And again, this event, this conflict between Morocco and the Songhai Empire, leads to the end. This event marks the end of the Songhai Empire, which then split into several kingdoms, which we've talked about before. And then later on, Portugal and Spain would come in, invade the region, take advantage of the weakness, and so would the French, to be quite honest, and control much of that area later on. So very devastating for the Songhai Empire overall. Now, one of the next things that we'll get into here is the commercial revolution. We've talked about the commercial revolution. You have the definition here, right? The transformation to a trade-based economy using silver and gold, right? But most of the things that we've talked about so far have been sort of contributing factors or the effects of the commercial revolution. The commercial revolution is highly transformational, and it includes the transformation from kind of localized economies to a global economy based on trading in gold and silver, right? I want you to kind of think back a little bit when we've talked about, say, the Song Dynasty. We talked about transitioning from producing things for local consumption, right? Whether you were producing enough, say, food or anything for like your own family or your community, to producing things for profit, producing things for sale. We talked about that previously in the Song Dynasty. We've talked about some examples throughout, but this happened worldwide, right? This commercial revolution. Eventually, everyone is producing things, almost everyone is producing things for more than just their own consumption. They're producing things to satisfy the needs of their communities, but they're also producing enough to sell on the open market. Colonies in the Americas, right? This leads to colonization. This leads to commercial, and I want you to remember, sorry, just to kind of go back, commercialization happens at different points in different places at different times. So again, Song Dynasty is one example. We've talked about others. But worldwide commercial revolution occurs after European exploration and colonization. Okay? So colonies in the Americas resulted in the mining of gold and silver, particularly by the Spanish. That fuels the commercial revolution, leads to inflation. Colonies produce huge amounts of wealth for their parent countries in Europe, helping create a population boom. In Europe, you have the joint stock companies that are born to sort of capitalize on overseas trade, contributing to the commercial revolution. This creates fierce rivalries and conflicts that we've discussed that are factors and results of the commercial revolution. So you see those examples there. New ocean trade routes, population growth, mining of gold and silver, rivalries between states. Those are all things that come about because of this transition to a trade-based economy using gold and silver. Okay. So next we're going to move into revisiting some of these trade systems. We're going to talk specifically about triangular trades. We'll talk about the continuities and changes in networks of exchange from 1450 to 1750. So we've used this example that you see on the slide of triangular trade, where enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas to work in some capacity, in this case, in this example that you see on the screen, in producing sugar. That sugar then taken back to Europe, created and used in creating finished goods that are then sold back to Africa or taken back to the colonies, sold there. Okay. So triangular trade comes up several times because it is a huge economic shift that is part of this commercial revolution. Okay. Again, the example that we're seeing here, how did we do this, right? Finished goods like firearms are traded for slaves in Africa. So the example we talked about earlier of Morocco, right, using guns, they got those guns in exchange for things. And in some cases along the coasts of West Africa, guns were traded for people, right, traded for slaves. Those enslaved Africans are then brought to the Americas to produce goods, sugar, tobacco, other things, right, work the land. They become laborers, and then those goods that are made there or grown there are then taken back to Europe. So this is an example of triangular trade, but I want you to keep in mind that it is not the only example. Sugar is not the only example of triangular trade. However, any example that we talk about or that we will see will usually involve finished European goods being sold not only to Africa but to other countries, but then the enslaved Africans traded out for those things, brought back to the Americas, and then raw material like sugar and tobacco brought back to Europe. Okay, so later we'll take a look at some of the social, cultural, and political effects that has, but I want to make sure that you understand what triangular trade looks like. So I want to pause for just a second here to sort of take a step back, look at some of the changes and continuities that happen because of global trade networks. Okay, so changes are very significant. There's a lot of changes, right? The discovery of the Americas and mercantilist competition opens up the Atlantic market. So you see the rise of the Atlantic markets. So that includes triangular trade. The Spanish are very successful at mining silver in the Americas, and that brings silver onto the world market. Okay, and that silver is used to trade and is a major component of the commercial revolution, which happens because goods are traded for silver and gold rather than for other goods. Right? You have China and East India seeing an influx of silver as they send out and export a huge amount of silk. You have joint stock companies or chartered monopolies that dominate and maintain these new trade routes. That's new, right? These creation of those corporations. And then, of course, you have improvements in shipping technology, which increases the volume of goods that can be traded around the world. And we've touched on some of those in 4.1. Now, for continuities, what continued after all of these trade networks, right? So there's so much change, but we still see traditional regional markets in Afro-Eurasia that continued. Okay, but this peasant labor, this artisanal labor, which was responsible for European wool, Indian cotton, Chinese silk, right? We've talked about the example of silk in Song China. That still takes place. China still produces silk, right? But now they're just producing more. So it is a continuation. There's a slight change, right? Because there's more production. And that production is a result of the trade, the commercial revolution that we've talked about. So regional textile production increases, okay, but there is an increase because there's much more demand. Okay? Now, this here, slide 17, okay, does the Atlantic slave trade represent a change or a continuity in this period? Now, for my AP students, I want you to write down your answer in your notes, okay? Because this is a really good point to sort of clarify what makes up a change versus a continuity in the AP class. And I want to make sure that you have an idea of what to do. So you can pause this video, write down some thoughts in your notes, and then in just a second, you'll have the opportunity to type in your answer in Edpuzzle. Okay? Does the Atlantic slave trade, right, trading of enslaved people from Africa, represent a change or a continuity in this period? And that's what I want you to think about, right? It's really important. We just went over the changes and continuities. How does the Atlantic slave trade fit into that idea? So think about that and then give me your answer. Now, the answer for my pre-AP students and for my AP students, now that you've given me your answer, is that the Atlantic slave trade is a huge change in this period. Right? It occurs along these new trade routes. It brings about fundamental changes to the systems of slavery that exist. You talked about that in 4.4. It causes changes in demographics in society. There's cultural changes. There's cultural blending. It's part of the commercial revolution, which the world changes how it does trade, how it does business. So the Atlantic slave trade is a huge change, a major change in this period. So I want to make sure that you understand how you can identify those things as changes, and that's something that we'll talk about later on. So in this objective, in this last section, section 3, we're going to talk about social and cultural developments, right? How does the political, economic, and cultural factors affecting society from 1450 to 1750? And then we'll talk about the similarities and differences in belief systems and how that affected society. So we'll talk about gender and family restructuring. We'll talk about demographic changes in Africa as a result of the trade in enslaved persons. We'll talk about the Atlantic trading system. And in some cases, we'll talk about the increase and intensification of interactions between newly connected hemispheres that helps kind of develop existing religions or contributes to religious conflicts. So we'll talk about those things as we go. So for this slide here, okay, this one is really just a question, right? What changes do you know or think you know that occurred in West Africa as a result of triangular trade? This is something we're going to do together in class, so we can move forward in this one. Okay, so on your guided note sheet, you can skip this part, this question, and then on the next page, you can skip the chart as well. Let me show you what that chart looks like. Okay, it is the spice chart. Okay, you can skip this one on the next page. Okay, and we'll move forward to talking about the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, so in previous lectures, we've talked about how some of the African states directly engaged with the Portuguese in the slave trade, such as the Kingdom of Congo. We talked about that in 4.4. Okay, now here we're going to look at another example, and specifically we're going to take a look at the Kingdom of Dahomey. Okay, the Kingdom of Dahomey really, its whole existence, the rise of the kingdom, the growth of the kingdom, and ultimately later on the demise and the fall of the kingdom, completely coincides with the Atlantic slave trade. Okay? The Dahomey society itself was highly militarized, and you combine that militarization with the demand for slave labor. Those two things lead the kingdom to really grow politically and economically during the Atlantic slave trade years. Once the Dahomey conquer the land that extends all the way to the coast, and you can see an image there to the right of the slide, the kingdom is highlighted in a light blue. Once that kingdom kind of extends further out, and if you remember, the Songhai Empire falls apart, breaks apart into smaller sized kingdoms. This is one of those, the Kingdom of Dahomey, then extends out to the coast, and that extension out to the coast gives them access to connections with the Portuguese, okay, and Europeans. So once they have that access, they now have access to the slave trade. They begin capturing and selling slaves to the European powers. They do this in exchange for gunpowder, rifles, tobacco, alcohol, other products, other goods, right? And so again, this creates an increase, an influx of gunpowder and rifles, and that enhances their already existing military prowess, right? Their military ability, okay? And this increase in military prowess then feeds their ability to then capture even more people to trade into the Atlantic slave trade. Right? One thing to also note here about the Dahomey Kingdom is they have an all-female military unit that was so successful and effective that at one point the kingdom asks all able-bodied daughters to join the military, which is very different to Western society, where most of the cases it's all able-bodied men that are asked to join the armed forces. So up through the end of the kingdom of Dahomey, the kingdom of Dahomey would actually last all the way up until the 1900s, 1904, which is well past the dates that we're talking about here in 1750. But I want to make sure that you understand as well how the slave trade illustrates the entire existence of this kingdom. Okay, uh, so in the mid 1800s, right, we start to see slavery end in the Americas. Right, think about the American Civil War, which is fought completely over, well, maybe not completely, but mostly over slavery. Slavery then starts to get banned in lots of different countries in the Americas. So the end of the slave trade would later lead to the complete decline of the kingdom of Dahomey, and that would weaken the kingdom, and then eventually, right, because they're not bringing in anything, they're not trading in anything anymore, really, so they're very weak. And then in the 1900s, 1904 is when they are invaded and then conquered by France. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they are completely taken over by the Europeans. So let's take a look at this cycle for the kingdom of Dahomey, using the kingdom of Dahomey as an example. But I want you to also keep in mind that this example, this cycle, can be applied for a lot of the Western African kingdoms that were involved in the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, so let's start with the gray section, right? The demand for slaves. Europeans create this huge demand for enslaved Africans. In order to acquire those enslaved Africans, they bring products or goods, such as guns, right? Trading rifles, gunpowder, and yes, in some cases, alcohol, tobacco, other products for slaves. Okay? Uh, and then, right, uh, that it helps increase the military power of these African kingdoms, which gives them the expansion of their ability to expand slave efforts as a result of their superior weaponry. And then that gives them more wealth and political power, right? So the kingdom strengthens, expands because of its wealth and power that's generated from the slave trade. That increased wealth and power puts them in a position to meet that increased demand for slaves, which brings more guns, more, and that brings more, right? So you see how this starts to put us into a cycle. Okay. Later on, the kingdom of Dahomey would try to diversify its economy, right? As the slave trade kind of fizzled out, uh, it's not very successful ultimately. So the slave trade was probably the most lucrative and profitable thing for the kingdom of Dahomey. But I want you to keep in mind, right, this cyclical nature, this cycle, right, in slave trade can be used for almost any African state and illustrate this pattern. Right? So, in any time we talk about an African state that's involved in the slave trade, I want you to keep this cycle in mind. Okay? So, what are the political consequences? Right? Governance and politics, that theme that we talked about, deals with expansions, decline, and military conflicts. The transatlantic slave trade has direct political consequences for West Africa because African states that trade with Europeans were able to expand their territory. They then were in conflict with some of their neighboring states. So there's an increased conflict between neighboring African states. And all of that is a consequence of being involved in the African slave trade. Right? Being involved in the Atlantic slave trade directly increases conflict in neighboring states because there is an effort to increase territory. Increased territory means there's more places for you to take enslaved people from to sell. So this is a political consequence of the slave trade in West Africa. What is the social consequence? So let's take a look at the social consequences of slave trade in West Africa. Of course, it does sound very weird to say this way, right? So I don't want you to necessarily get the wrong idea. But the transatlantic slave trade depletes a lot of the population in Africa, and it has significant social and demographic ramifications for West African society. The most in-demand slaves were young men, right? And I want you to think about why that's the case. Young men are highly sought after uh, by traders, slave traders, because the young men would be able to go and work in the fields, work producing sugar, tobacco, ultimately, eventually cotton, things like that, right? Because of their perceived strength, right? So we do see some women, of course, we do see some children traded as well, but the most highly sought after are physically fit men. So that increases the population, excuse me, the proportion of the population that is female. So with this increased proportion or percentage of population that's female, you see higher examples of what we call polygyny or polygamy, right? Uh, so we see men taking on more than one wife. And what is the effect of that? And you see kind of the region that we're talking about in this area. Okay? So we see a disproportionately high number of women that increases the likelihood of polygamous relationships where men take on more than one wife. But that can also help us, that shift in demographics can help us understand the current trends that we see in Africa today. Polygyny is linked with gender inequality. Polygyny is, as a result of transatlantic slave trade, shows us that there's gender inequality still in Africa, right? 10% of marriages, even in the mid 2000s, are still polygamous. And that affects poverty rates, that affects child mortality, that affects rates of female depression. So, this is one example, one social consequence that even still today is a lasting consequence of the African slave trade. And that is why studying things like this, so we can understand why their societies are in the positions that they are in and what impacts those have had and how to address those things, right? But that is an example of the social consequence. Now let's move on to religion, right? These global connections bring different religions into contact with each other. And when you have religions that collide, right, or connect, you can either do one of two things. It can either help blend into something new, into what we call a syncretic religion, right? And the definition for syncretism is there, the combining of different religions or schools of thought, right? Or it can cause conflict. So we'll talk about both here. And we're taking a look at the religions that arrive um, in the Americas and the new syncretic religions that form as a result of that. So Europeans and enslaved Africans both introduced their religions to the New World. So at the top, you see the religions that arrive. You see, of course, Christianity arriving with the European powers, the Spanish, the Portuguese, eventually the English and the Dutch bring with them their beliefs in Christianity. The enslaved Africans were, a lot of them, a significant portion of them were, maybe about 10 to 15% of them were Muslim, right? And so they bring with them Islam. Okay, so this is the introduction of Islam into the Americas. So the reason why Islam is even around in the Americas today is because it's brought with the enslaved Africans. But the enslaved Africans also bring with them their own individual religions. Okay, so those are the religions that arrive. And then we see some combination, some combining of that. So this is where we see the syncretic religions or syncretism. So you have the cult of Guadalupe, Santeria, Candomblé, which we'll talk about some of these in just a second on some more of these examples. So the cult of Guadalupe, right? And many of you may be familiar with the Virgen de Guadalupe, the Virgin Mary, right? This example, the Virgin Mary, this particular example of the Virgin Mary, is actually used by Franciscan friars, by Catholic priests, to leverage that syncretism in favor of making converting to Catholicism much easier for the native population, right? The Our Lady of Guadalupe is an example of how actually this is a mix between Catholic beliefs mixing with indigenous native populations beliefs, right? Aztec beliefs mixing with the idea of the apparition of the Virgin Mary, right? It is this depiction of the Virgin Mary that native populations begin to worship. They worship this particular image, right? Now, the Franciscan friars, the Catholic priests, were not attempting to teach worshiping this image, but they were trying to make this worship, they were attempting to make converting to Catholicism much easier. Native populations begin to worship her, believing that believing in the image itself can work miracles and things like that. So the cult of Guadalupe itself kind of departs off of Catholicism, right? But again, the cult of Guadalupe using the Our Lady of Guadalupe as an attempt to convert native populations. This is an example of the blending and mixing of religions. So it's a mix of the Aztec beliefs, it's a mix of the Catholicism beliefs. So that is where we see these two religions combine. Then next you have Candomblé in Brazil. This is an example of essentially a diasporic religion, right, or a diaspora of an African religion in Brazil. And it's developed through a syncretism between Catholicism and traditional West African religion. So in the 1700s, Brazil begins receiving slaves from the Dahomey region and its surrounding areas. This religion, this Candomblé, is a result of Dahomey traditional beliefs with Catholicism. Okay? Now, the religion itself is far more complex than what we can really get into, but the connection between the two religions is a link between the Catholic saints to the Orixás, which are the deities or the gods that are found in West African religions. The one here on the right is a mix of the Orixa Yemanja, which is a water spirit that's usually associated with the Virgin Mary. So this is an example of how the West African traditions mixed with Catholicism to create a new religion, a third religion, right? So this begins in the 1700s with this later wave of slaves that come from the Dahomey region. Now, outside of the Americas, we've seen examples of syncretism. We've talked about Sikhism in India, which began in the 1500s in the Punjab region of India. Right? We don't want to assume that Sikhism is purely a blend of, say, Islam and Hinduism, but it does take inspiration from Islam. It does take inspiration from Hinduism. It does take inspiration from the Bhakti movement to create a new religion. And so this again is an example of syncretism, right? It's not a purely syncretic religion, right? It's not just taking influences from two religions and combining them. It's taking that inspiration, creating something new and different, right? It's inspired by parts of those earlier religions, but it is an example of something completely new. Okay, and then of course we've talked about the Protestant Reformation, right, which is a religious conflict that can arise. So the Protestant Reformation was a result of challenges to Catholicism, right, to the power of the Pope. So we've seen that example, a challenging of the Pope's authority that results in brand new branches of non-Catholic Christianity. Okay? And then we've also talked about the split in the Muslim faith, between the Sunni and the Shia, right? As we've talked about, disagreements about how leaders in the religion should be selected results in the split between the Sunni and the Shia, and then that split intensifies conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavids, for example. And then again, there is still what we would call sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shia, and still conflict and things in disagreement based on that split well back in this period. So keep those things in mind as we think about syncretism and how that influences religion. So these are the ideas that are important for you to review out of topic 4.5. So mercantilist policies used by European rulers to expand and maintain their empires, joint stock companies, the Dutch East India Company, the British or English East India Company, how those financed exploration and influenced colonization, the rivalries that exist. And then again, remember some of the continuities and changes that exist in the regional markets and in the slave trades and trade in general, right? Despite the many changes to global trade in this period, remember the continuity in regional markets like China's silk markets. Okay? And then lastly, the transatlantic slave trade, very important to know about how it changed Africa, how it changed America, including political changes, demographic changes, religious changes, cultural changes. Those cultural changes are very important as well. So these are the key ideas to focus on out of 4.5. Thanks for watching through this video. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to let me know.